park rangers warn about the dangers in Mount Rainier National Park, and a man by the name of Ethan experienced just that. He states the following: "My wife and I have been going to the Cougar Rock Campground for about 10 years now. We love the forest and being surrounded by tall red cedars and Douglas fir trees. The Wonderland Trail is one of our favorite trails to hike. Even though we have never hiked the full 93 miles of trail, our usual hike stays within the 10 to 15 mile range, something we can handle in a day of hiking. We normally stay at Campground number 3, which is somewhat secluded and only allows 25 people at the site. It also has plenty of water, flat areas to camp, and trails off in all directions. This particular day was June 11th. It was roughly 6:30 a.m., and I decided to go for a hike on the trail that takes you along the Nisqually River. It's only about a mile, give or take, to Madcap Falls, and I told my wife I would be back in time for breakfast. About a half mile into the hike, I began to hear strange noises that sounded like it was coming from the tops of one of the trees. I stopped, looked up, but could not see anything, so I shrugged my shoulders and continued on my hike. About 5 minutes later, I not only heard a noise coming from the trees, but I could smell an odor in the air reminding me of rotting eggs. So I stop again, taking my time to look around the area, looking towards the trees. As I was staring into the tree line, I saw what resembled to be a very tall person perched atop a large branch about maybe 10 or so feet up on one of the trees. I couldn't make out any facial features or any distinguishing features, but it sure looked like a person perched on that branch. While continuing to stare at this mystery person, I realized they or it was staring back at me. As I did, I noticed its face was wrong. It looked more gorilla than human. At this point, the gears start turning in my head. My heart started to beat a little faster, as I was not sure what it was or if it might be dangerous. I began to look around and see if there was anybody else on the trail with me. I was hoping to have somebody else see this thing. When I looked back at whatever it was in the tree, I noticed it wasn't wearing any clothes. It was one solid color. I realize now more than ever that this had to have been an animal. A bear, but bears don't look quite like this. The shape was wrong. The face was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Once again, I looked around for a few seconds to see if anybody else was on the trail so I could be validated in what I was looking at. I looked back up at the tree, and now this mysterious animal of what I originally thought was a person was now gone. I thought to myself, okay, Ethan, it's clearly early in the morning. Maybe you are still a little tired and you were just imagining seeing something. I know, staring into the woods sometimes can become a bit distorted. Calm down. I know that I was not very far from the fall, so I kept on walking. The trail does level off a little bit after it turns away from the river. It was at this spot that I noticed that the noise I heard earlier was now coming from a tree to my left. The noise was almost like a person talking, but it sounded strange and quiet. And then it would alternate between loud and quiet. It kind of reminded me of fast-talking chitter-chatter. I looked around again to see if there was anybody else around, but again, I did not see a soul. The noise sounded like it was getting closer and closer, but I still could not make out any distinguishing features. By this time, I was almost to the top of the trail and decided that it would be best for me if I just kept going. When I got to the top of this trail, right at the falls, there is this flat area and about a 20-foot drop-off to the other side. There were several large rocks up there that people could sit on and enjoy the beautiful view. So I sat down for about 10 minutes to collect my bearings, as I was getting a little shaky and needed to calm down. I mean, after all, I felt like I might be on the verge of a mental breakdown, having these strange hallucinations. I decided that it would be best to start heading back down the way I came. Maybe this hike wasn't a good idea. Maybe I needed to have some coffee in my system, or some food. I had only walked about 50 feet from the top when I heard the noise again. It was coming from the trees off the trail directly to my right, and it sounded now like it was about 20 feet up in the trees. This time, I could tell it was much closer to me, but still not visible. I tried looking around again, not being able to see anything. I kept walking. About 50 feet farther down, I stopped and looked up. This time, I could see a figure. The tree it was in was about 10 feet around, and I could only see the figure from about shoulder level to just above its head. It was roughly about 20 feet up in the tree. I could make out that it had a very large body and was covered in thick, woolly hair. Again, I failed to make out any specific facial features that would give it away, but as it moved a little bit, it looked like its head was bobbing up and down. I was about 30 feet from it and can see what looked like either its shoulder or elbow. I stopped for a moment or two and watched it to see what it was going to do, but I could not figure out what was going on. After about a minute, it began to climb down from the tree, and once it got to the ground, it began to move away from the tree and deeper into the woods. I don't know why, but for some reason, I decided it was a good idea to follow it, but at a safe distance, so if it was an animal, to try and not spook it. I think my reasoning was that if this was a Bigfoot, I wanted to get a better look. As I got closer, which was on my left side and about 10 feet away, I noticed it was now looking at me. It never moved fast, but slowly and deliberate. It kept looking at me and never making a sound. This animal moved 20 feet away from me before it got behind a tree, and my vision of it was now obscured. By the time I got around the tree to see where it went, it was now gone. I returned to where this thing climbed down the tree and found a lot of hair that was clumpy and looked very dark in color. It stunk and was very matted. I tried to gather some of it, but it kind of just dissipated and fell out of my hand. The little bit I kept in my hand fell apart as soon as it came off the tree. Now, I could not run fast enough back to camp and tell my wife that I genuinely saw something I couldn't explain. I wanted her to go back up there with me. We hiked back together, but could not find anything. As we were later on hiking back down, I began to tell her that the creature must have slipped down the hill and headed in her direction, as I could hear it on my back trail. She thought that I was just trying to tease her, but as we got close to camp, she heard the noise also. When we both arrived at the camp, I noticed that some of the other campers were up and standing around outside their tents. When they saw me, they asked if we all heard the noise. I shared with them what had just happened to me, and they told me that it had been going on all night long. They tried to convince their kids to go back to sleep, but their kids were too frightened. They said that they sat around and listened for a while. It would come close to the camp and then move further away. This behavior went on till dawn. I told them I must be a sound sleeper because I did not hear a thing during the night, nor did my wife. One of the campers said he did not get any sleep at all that night and packed up his gear and left. I've been hiking and camping in this area for well over 20 years. Ever since I was a lad, my family would come to the park several times a year because my dad and mom loved to hike and camp there. And what I encountered reminded me of a time when camping with my parents in the same park. I was 13, and our family consisted of me, my older brother Nathan, who is 2 years older than I, and of course my mom and dad. When we went camping as a family, one of our favorite activities was to take a few short hikes together, typically lasting between 5 and 7 miles in total. On the other hand, because my brother and I had reached an age where we were physically capable of hiking longer distances, our father suggested that this time we hike some of the longer trails along the Wonderland Trail. I still remember what happened on that particular day, just as if it was yesterday. It is always in the back of my mind whenever I go hiking in the Mount Rainier National Park. On this particular day, my brother Nathan and I were with my father, and we're hiking up the Wonderland Trail. My family and I had been on this particular trail before, and in fact, we had hiked it quite a few times. Although this time, we hiked a trail that was considerably longer than what we had done previously. For us, this did not constitute anything out of the ordinary. When I think back to that day, I remember the trail was absolutely gorgeous, and we did not encounter very many other hikers along the way. My brother Nathan and I were having a hard time keeping up with our father because we wore old hiking shoes and Dad was wearing a pair of hiking boots. We often stopped to tie our shoelaces and talk for a while. Then we would be off again, enjoying every second of the beautiful Pacific Northwest scenery around us. As the day went on, I remember that we had been hiking for at least 3 hours by now, and were starting to get a little worn out. I was also starting to get hungry, so my father decided to take a break. We stopped, ate lunch in the middle of this breathtaking meadow that was encircled on all sides by towering evergreen trees and thick, luscious timber. Since we started our hike, the first time I saw a deer was when we reached this point in our own journey. I estimated that I was about 100 yards away from it when I noticed that it looked different from a normal deer, and it did not have a tail. When I had asked my father if he had ever seen a deer without a tail, all he could say was that the animal must have been very young. Not really quite sure what that means. As we're watching the lone deer across the meadow, I began to notice several other deer had come out of the forest and were right in front of us, probably no more than 30 feet away from me and my father. Those deer were not alarmed by the other deer. The one that we were watching was now running around in circles as though it had no care or concern for the other. Then all of a sudden, it stopped running in circles, and we noticed it did something that we had never seen a deer do before. And that's when we could tell it looked different from any of the other deer we'd ever seen. Hear me out. It began walking on 2 legs. We watched it for about a minute or two, and then it was gone. Just like that. It must have seen us, ran off into the woods. And we stayed in that meadow for about a half hour or so, trying to rack our brains on what we had just seen. Then my dad suggested that we keep heading up the trail as to not waste any more time. He clearly had no comments on it and did not want to speak about it. We did not see the deer or anything else for about an hour. But we could, of course, hear various noises coming from the woods that we could not identify. Mostly, what sounded like a kind of moaning sound and loud cracking noises, as though you can hear timber and large branches breaking in the distance. I'm still not quite sure how to explain this whole experience, but long story short, this is my collection of strange and weird stories that have happened to me personally in this area. I hope you enjoy. For the record, my husband, Steve, and I did not believe in Bigfoot as a whole. We thought there was probably some undiscovered animal or breed of bear or possibly primate in these areas. We have seen many bears in our life and can definitely say that what we saw was not a bear. Here we go. We were on our way to White River Campground, driving on Highway 410 in our RV. Even though there wasn't a lot of traffic on the road, there was still enough of it to make the journey to the camping spot a little bit slower. We were only going at about 25 miles per hour, which was fine by us because the view out of the window is breathtaking. As we approached the turnoff to the campground, we saw what appeared to be a bear coming out of the woods from the opposite side of the road. Nothing unusual at first, right? Simply because you're in the middle of the Oregon/Washington forest where there is an abundance of bears and various wildlife. But it was larger and was walking upright on 2 feet. It began to walk across the road right in front of us, and then continued along the shoulder of the right side of the road. This bear, or what we thought was a bear at first, had slightly bowed legs as opposed to a bear's, which are more solid. The arms, too, we noted as we watched it stride, were longer, with a much broader chest than a bear. The head was smaller in proportion to the body. The back was slightly curved and had hair a little shorter than shoulder length. I did notice the hair on its back was slightly wavy, which I found odd. I could only see the face when it got close to the RV as it was walking alongside the road. The face was flat, not snouty at all like a bear. Its eyes were large and had a flat nose. Again, more like a gorilla or primate, or a human than a bear. The eyes appeared to be almost black. I could see a little bit of the chest and hip area. The hair on the hip was long and curly, and the hair on the chest looked a little shorter. The color was more brownish black, not as red or orange as I thought it would be. The hair on the face was much lighter, almost like a whitish gray. We were simply transfixed on the face as it walked along our side of the road. I was on the passenger side and got a pretty good view. For some reason, I was convinced that it could see us in the RV because it looked right at us as we got close to it. The windshield and side windows of the RV are large and easy to see out of. They also sit high off the ground. And this creature was tall enough to be head-to-head with me as I sat looking at it, and it passed no more than 5 feet from us. When I saw the creature getting closer, I could not believe what I was seeing. It took a few seconds for my brain to really kick in and process what I was looking at. We were only a few miles from the campground in total. We did not want to scare it away by honking the horn or trying to chase it off. We just kept trying to get a better look at this anomaly. As we got closer and passed by it, it went out of sight over a small hill. It's hard to believe that an animal with that much size and shape could hide so easily and quickly. The area it was walking along the highway is somewhat open grassland, but it ends at the tree line. There's a small river on the right side of Highway 410 that runs under some large rocks. It is located just before the entrance to White River Campground. We were nervous that it might be following us. We watched outside our RV as we drove down the gravel road to our site, and we noticed another RV coming into the campsite right behind us. We scooted our RV as far back into the site as we could. As soon as we got the RV situated, my husband and I walked over to the other RV that had entered behind us. We were curious if they had seen this thing too. We couldn't believe it when the man driving the other RV said to my husband, "We were just talking about that thing we saw. It crossed the road in front of you." The man introduced himself as Mark Parr and his wife Linnell. He said, "Man, I've never seen anything like that. I thought it was a bear at first, but that thing wasn't a bear. It was walking on 2 feet and was tall. He said it had a long face, but kind of flat-looking big eyes and a short nose. It looked far more human than animal to him and was much larger than he initially expected." They were only about 200 yards behind us as we drove down the road. Mark said he watched as that thing crossed right in front of us and was on our side of the road as we drove by it. When his RV passed by it, it was still walking on 2 feet. And he said, yeah, it looked right at him too. It made eye contact with me. It looked directly into my eyes. It didn't even flinch when we drove by it. It just kept walking, but much faster than I thought it would. I had the sense that this thing could run very fast if need be, Mark said. I hit the brakes softly and looked through my mirrors. I wanted to see where this thing was going. Linnell was in the back of the RV when I saw it. I yelled to her to look out the window. Linnell then said, after Mark shouted, I looked out the window, and we were just passing by this thing. She said it was strange because I got the sense that it was recognizing the fact that we were there, because it was looking up and right into the windows as if it were trying to see inside. She continued, as we passed, it turned back to look over its right shoulder at us. I was now staring at it through the rear window. I looked right at its face because its eyes were looking right at mine. I swear, then it actually turned its body more to the right, almost as if it was going to turn around and continue to stare. I can't recall how long the sighting lasted. It disappeared from view as we came around the bend in the road. After it was gone, I went to the front of the RV, and Mark and I just looked at each other and said, "Did we just see what I think we saw?" Mark then said, "Yeah. As we followed behind you, we were hoping we would be able to talk to you guys about it too. I'm glad you pulled into the same campground." He added, "What do you think it was?" Diane had chimed in, and she said, "I knew what Steve would say, so before he could answer, I blurted out, 'Bigfoot,'" Diane said. We all just looked at each other and kind of nodded in agreement, except Steve. I could see that Steve was just about to say something when Mark said, "That's exactly what we thought," Linnell said. "I watched it looking at me, and it felt creepy. I know it was not a bear or anything like that. It recognized I was looking right at it. The look on its face, the expression that it wore, was so human-like. For a second, I felt this maternal compassion for it as we locked in eye contact. After a little more discussion of what had occurred that day, we returned to our RV. When we had finished dinner, as I was making up the bedding, Steve went out to check that everything was hooked up before it got dark, and we locked up for the night. He walked around our site and saw a trail that led from the highway to where we were parked. It was a large area of grass that had been stepped on, and the hair was redder near where we were parked, but it got darker and blacker the further it went into the trees. He said that he thought there was a small stream or wet area just past where we were parked, because the ground was softer, and he could see where something had walked through the wet area. The footprints were larger than a human's foot, and the stride was longer than any human would make. Unfortunately, we did not have the proper materials or equipment to make a cast. Steve told her that as he was walking back to the RV, he heard something moving in the woods. Thinking at first it might be a bear, he began shouting, in hopes that his voice would scare it away. Then he heard the sound of a large branch breaking. He said it wasn't the sound that a branch makes when someone steps on it. It sounded as if a branch was being broken, a thick branch, mind you, high up off the tree. He turned in the direction of the sound, and that's when he said he saw the creature again. It was no farther away than 20 feet at most. It had come out from behind a tree and was standing there staring at him. It did not seem bothered that I was there, he said, Steve told her. I just froze in position, not knowing whether I should run or stand still. So I started to move back towards, keeping my eyes on it. I had to move slowly because I did not want to trip over the brush, he said. I watched as this thing, I know this sounds crazy, but it kind of smirked at me, like it had recognized me from seeing me on the road earlier. Then it took a step back into the woods and was gone. I didn't hear any footsteps as it disappeared, so I just turned around and came back here. Steve then told Diane, I know it wasn't a bear, and now he thinks that what we saw might indeed be a Bigfoot. The next day, we saw Mark and Linnell standing outside their RV. We walked over, and Steve shared with them what he had experienced the night before. Mark responded, That's interesting because during the night, I swore I kept hearing something walking around behind our RV. Our curtains closed, and when I peeked out, I didn't see anything. But I wasn't going to go outside during the night in case it was a bear. Then this morning when we got up, Linnell and I walked to the back of the RV and saw giant footprints. Come, I'll show you. All four of us walked to the back of their RV, and sure enough, there were giant footprints leading from the woods to their RV's back window and back into the woods again. Mark had asked, Do you think we should go to the ranger station and report this? At this, we looked at each other, and together, we all laughed and said, Nah. Linnell jokingly said, Well, this sure is one for the books. To which again we all laughed. The rest of our time on that trip was spent hiking as planned, with no more sightings of what we now laugh about as our Bigfoot story. I hope some of your listeners can relate to what we encountered. We don't know if it was a real Bigfoot, but it sure makes us wonder what else could be out there in the woods that we don't know about.